But it's all there. I promise everything is on there for the lecture. Because for this unit, AP and IB have kind of veered a little bit, there is going to be some stuff that the IB people don't need, and there's going to be some stuff in the lecture that the AP people don't need. But that's okay. Have you ever been penalized for being too smart on a test? Well, that just sucks. But the answer should be no. If you write with information that isn't exactly in the syllabus but it's correct, you're fine. So just be aware of that. Our unit is biodiversity and conservation. Your test is November 4th. So that's going to be your next test date. Starting with the idea of biodiversity. There are 3 types of biodiversity that lead to resilience of our planet, lead to resilience of our ecosystems. The first one is species diversity. Think about all of the different animals that are out there, all of the different plants, all of the different bacteria and algae and fungi. That's all species diversity. When we talk about our mass extinctions, where 96% of everything on Earth went extinct, that's our right, because the 4% that's left is usually very diverse, and evolution begins again out of that 4%. Because we've got this mass species diversity, no matter what happens, we can almost guarantee that life will continue to exist on the planet, even if it's just cockroaches. Genetic diversity is a variation within species and organisms. So if you guys all look around, you all look different. So if we get rid of the ozone layer and all of the blonde and blue-eyed people disappear, are Homo sapiens still going to survive? Yeah, because we are all different. We all have that ability to be a little bit different and to possibly survive some environmental change. We do know, however, that the smaller the population, the smaller the genetic diversity. This is our fear with our terminal species, those that exist only in zoos. The genetic diversity is so low that we start inbreeding these organisms, which has a whole other host of problems. That we start losing the genetic diversity when our population numbers drop. Habitat diversity means that there's tons of ecological niches out there, and that for almost anything we're looking for, animals are going to find a home. So we have that out there for them in the ecosystems. What's the benefit to high biodiversity then? The biggest term here is resilience. The more diversity you have, the more resilient your planet, your ecosystem, your species is to change. So as humans start kind of putting their fingers in the pot and stirring things up, if there's diversity, organisms are going to make it. We can't screw up the planet horribly if there's a lot of diversity. We know that genetic diversity increases resistance to disease. If we have a pandemic come through, some of you aren't going to make it. But are all of you going to die? Probably not. So if we have genetic diversity, disease isn't going to wipe us out. When you look at this map, the areas in red have low biodiversity and the areas in green have high biodiversity. What is common of my areas in red? Why do they have low biodiversity? What do we know about the climate? It's cold, it's extreme. Are we going to have a lot of plants growing there? And if we don't have a lot of plants, are we going to have a lot of primary productivity? Are we going to have a basis for our food webs? No. Well, then here's the next question. When you look at that map, if I have limited funds, limited energy, which areas should I save? If I can only save one area, where should I save? Should I save the red area? I should save a green area, because the green area has high biodiversity. High biodiversity, high resilience, high ability to withstand humans. Lots of species. I want to save those areas of So as heart-wrenching as it is to see those pictures of the polar bears on the ice and like they're gonna die, should I spend all of my energy and money on the polar bears? No, I should redirect it to one of those green areas up there. When you look at biodiversity, what's the mathematical equation that we've been doing to examine biodiversity? Simpson's biodiversity, right? When you calculate it, you're looking at the number of species and how many individuals of each species. And we've been saying that a good Simpson's diversity number equals a healthy ecosystem. And that's true for the most part. There are some exceptions. The big exception here is fragmented territories. Nature preserves are a big example of a fragmented territory. They have something called edge effect. So a lot of us live on the edge of O'Neill, which is a fragmented territory. It's a nature preserve. But do all of the animals that live in O'Neill stay in O'Neill? No, right? In my backyard, and I'm about a half mile from the border of Upper O'Neill, we have possums and raccoons and rats and coyotes. All of this wildlife in my condo backyard. It hangs out at night and eats my fruit, goes after the neighbor's small yippy dog. And at the daytime, it goes back into the preserve. So if I were to count and do a Simpson's biodiversity of that Upper O'Neill area, it would have an artificially high biodiversity because you have animals that are straddling two environments. You have animals that are actually not feeding in O'Neill, not living their entire life in that preserve, but yet they would be counted towards the biodiversity of that preserve. So it's an artificially high number. Another example of how I can get an artificially high number is if I have Bureau of Land Management land that I have leased out to 6 different ranchers, and they've got 6 different types of hoof stock, goats and cows and sheep and llamas. And I go out and do a Simpson's biodiversity, it might come out artificially high because of all of these ranchers' animals that they have on that land. But are those animals endemic? Are they the ones normally there? No. So it might be an artificially high number. Sometimes we get artificially low numbers on the back end. If we have a ecosystem that is in climax community, and I just count the plants because the plants are easier to count, I'm going to have a lot of mature trees. But do a lot of things grow under trees? No, because they get shaded out. And so if I count only the plants, I might get an artificially low number in a stable, healthy ecosystem because the big plants don't allow for as much diversity as like the earlier stages of succession when I've got things like shrub and flowers. When we talk about healthy versus unhealthy ecosystems, we often talk about indicator species. An indicator species is a species that indicates that there's been some disturbance or that there's been pollution. Often, our amphibians are our indicator species. If I go out in the wild and I'm not seeing frogs or salamanders or any other amphibian, I know there's probably something wrong with that ecosystem. Our amphibians have to breathe through their skin, so they're super sensitive to pollution. They're the first ones to go awry. They're also the first ones, if there's chemicals in that ecosystem, like endocrine disruptors, that will have mutations like extra limbs or missing limbs show up. And so if I start seeing my frogs look weird, again, I know something's out in that ecosystem. Our indicator species don't have to be amphibians though, and they don't have to be sensitive to pollution. We can also have organisms that are tolerant to pollution be indicator species. You guys are going to do a Trent Biotic Index at some point. I think in January we're going to go out with the water district and do it. And we're looking at the insects that are there. If we see a lot of insects that are known to be pollution tolerant, that don't care if there's a lot of polluted water, and we're seeing them in a higher proportion than we're seeing our other insects, then we know the water's polluted. So we can look at our indicator species in either way. Species that don't do well in pollution, if they're absent, we know it's polluted. Or vice versa, species that do really well in polluted environments, like cockroaches and some of our aquatic insects, if they're there in high numbers, we know that the water's polluted. This is total random slide placement, and it's like in the wrong area, but we're going to go with it. Your animals are going to migrate. This is like the aside of all asides. Your animals are going to migrate either as long-term, short-term, or permanent. Long-term migration is seasonal migration. So when we look at the migration of gray whales off our coast, our gray whales are going to go up into the Bering Strait area and feed, and then they're going to go down south in the summer and breed in Baja, have their babies where it's shallow and where it's warm, and then they'll go back up for winter in the Bering Strait. This is a seasonal migration. It's following the climate pattern, it's following food. We have short-term migration. Flat-capped chickadees are my example for this. They are allowing their resource to basically come back after they feed. So they're going to feed in one grove of trees and eat the stuff out of the trees. And then they'll move to another grove of trees for a month or two, feed out of that grove, while the first grove regrows everything they ate. And then they'll go back. So they're basically partitioning their resources in a way that ensures that their resources are renewable. It's like what we should be doing as humans with all of our resources, the birds are intrinsically doing with their food source. Permanent migration is going to be on another slide, but it's essentially animals have a zone of tolerance that they like. They have a temperature range that is ideal. They have a precipitation range that is ideal. And they're going to move to stay in that. So as we have climate change, we're seeing a lot of our species permanently migrate north. So as it's getting hotter, they're going to move to northern latitudes to stay within that temperature range that they like. That's a permanent migration. Climate change isn't going away. And so they'll move up there permanently. The ICUN, which is the International Governing Body on Endangered Species, has come up with 30 areas that are called biodiversity hotspots. These are areas that have high biodiversity, that have a high proportion of endemic or native species that are found only in that area and nowhere else on the globe, and areas that are at great risk of losing all of that biodiversity. So these are areas that have already lost 70% of their land, that are within reach of high populations of humans, that are at great risk, but the International Governing Board has said these are areas we really need to preserve, that we really need to save. There are 30 total that are terrestrial. We also have some hotspots that are aquatic. We're not focusing on those, but realize they do exist. Of those, 10 are tropical rainforests, because tropical rainforests have very high biodiversity. Tomorrow, you're going to use this map, and you're going to pinpoint an area that you want to look at for a hotspot. Realize you all live in a biodiversity hotspot. So we are part of the California Floristic Province, which means our coastal shrubland is unique. It has high biodiversity and it's at great risk. And so we're looking to save that shrubland. All right, random slide placement number 2, aside number 2. When we talk about animals that are going to make it, we've got specialists and generalists. Which ones are going to make it more? Well, the generalist is like who you want to take on a date. Anywhere you take them, they're going to be happy. They'll eat anything and live anywhere. They're not picky. These guys make the best invasive species because they don't care where they live. It's okay. Specialists, on the other hand, are super picky. They've got one food source they like. They've got one area that they like to live in. They suck as invasive species because they are so picky. When you think about this, give me an example of a specialist. A koala, what do they eat? Eucalyptus. What happens if all the eucalyptus trees go away? The koalas go away. Can I take a koala and plop it down anywhere? No. So it's not a great invasive species. Give me an example of a great generalist. A feral pig. They don't care what they eat. They don't care where they live, and because of that, if you plop them down somewhere else, they're going to survive. So generalists are great invasive species. They're also the great survivor. So as the environment changes, our generalists are going to make it. Specialists, not so much. Okay, we are going to review evolution really quick. It's a quick run through. You've had evolution before. You had it in general bio. Evolution is important because evolution is the basis of our biodiversity. Evolution is how we get there. Evolution, in its most general form, is change over time. So how does a species change over a geologic time frame? We're not talking your lifetime. We're talking thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, millions of years. Change over time. Two types of change, two types of evolution. Microevolution is within a species. You are still the same species, but you're starting to see distinct differences among those species. That given enough time, given a geologic barrier, if you move to two different areas, that over enough time you eventually become two different species. Macroevolution is that ultimate division where you no longer recognize the other group as something that you could mate with. So if you look at our puppies, is that macro or microevolution? It's micro, right? They are all still the same species. That little puntable can still breed and have babies with the German Shepherd. So they haven't diverged that much yet. If I were to separate the little puntable onto an island and never let that little puntable see another dog again, and all of his ancestors never see another dog, and it's exposed to specific environmental conditions, is it possible that little puntable will become its own species? Totally. Mutation is the basis of evolution. Mutation is a random change in the DNA, and that random change could be bad, in which case the organism dies, could be silent, in which case there's no difference, or it could be beneficial. It could be something that allows you to survive in your environment better. It could be an extra little bit of speed. It could be your teeth are a little bit sharper. There is something about that mutation that makes it so that you live a little bit longer. And the goal here is to live long enough to have a lot of children. And in theory, because it's genetic, all of those children will carry that same mutation that makes them survive a little bit better as well. When we talk about the formation of a new species, it's based on the idea that life sucks, right? No matter how bad your life is, you could be a June bug. You think your life sucks? You could be this annoying bug that no one likes, that is blind, so it can't see, so that it makes this huge annoying noise, right? They make that buzzing. Guess what that does? Every bird in the neighborhood goes, ooh, there's a June bug around. And then it's fluorescent green, which is awesome if you're a June bug that stays in the trees, but do they always stay in the trees? No. And so you are basically a beacon to predators. So life sucks for a June bug. Mama June bug realizes that life is hard for her babies, so she has 1 million of them, with the realization that maybe only 1% of those are going to survive to adulthood. Those that survive to adulthood might have a mutation that's allowing them to survive over their brothers and sisters. Might have a mutation that means that maybe they've got a sense of smell and they know to stay in the trees, as opposed to coming out onto campus where they're going to get nailed by an iPhone. These are the ones that make it. And if they make it, they get to reproduce, and maybe they pass that mutation on. And maybe their children then pass it on, and eventually you get a new species. Darwin put all of this together. Well, so did Wallace, who is another guy that was working at the same time as Darwin, and there's theories that Darwin stole Wallace's information. It's all this intrigue. It's deep. But we credit Darwin with it. And again, Darwin said, moms have more babies than are going to survive because life is hard. Those that survive often have features that are best suited for their environment, and that's why they survive. And they survive long enough because they are well suited for their environment to have lots of babies, and their babies inherit those traits. Your reproductive success is your fitness. So how many babies you have is your measurement of how fit you are in our environment. Sometimes, though, random stuff happens. Sometimes you end up with a bottleneck. A bottleneck says that you've got these beetles. Some of them are brown, some of them are green. Obviously, if you're a beetle, being green is probably advantageous because you're probably in a forest. But then this big monster comes along and accidentally steps on all of the green beetles. So what's left to reproduce? What color? So what do all the future beetles look like? Brown. That's a bottleneck. There's no reason for it. It happened. A lot of times it happening is a ecological disaster. And it just happens to wipe out part of the population. What's left to repopulate carries specific genes, and those are the genes that pass on. There's no evolutionary benefit to that type of gene that survives. It just survives. The other one here is Founder's effect. Founder's effect says that a small group of the population breaks away and starts to live in a new area. Well, all of the offspring of those founders carry the genetics of the founders, whether or not they're beneficial. In America, our best example of this is the Amish. The Amish is a religion, a religious group that came over from Europe in the 1600s. You see them in the Midwest and the East Coast. They only marry within their religion. So Amish only marry Amish. And Amish are very distinct, right? These are the ones that look like it's still the 1600s. There's no electricity. There's no modern medicine. They have the horse and carriage. Well, the original group that came over and founded the American Amish, a bunch of them, just by random chance, had extra toes. Had an 11th toe. When you look at the preponderance of extra toes in the Amish population versus the population of America as a whole, you see more extra toes in the Amish. Does it give them super speed or better balance? Are they better gymnasts? No. Right? It's just this genetic mutation that we see more often in that sect of people because they have maintained their own genetics in that founding group. Two types of evolution that occur. Allopatric speciation is the one that is common. You have a geologic boundary that divides two populations of a species. Over geologic time, you start to see differences in the environments that these two species are living in. And because of that, what works adaptation-wise for one group does not work for the other. And then over enough time, there's a lot of changes, and you end up with two different species. If you look at our map here of California, at the top of California, those salamanders are all the same species. Over thousands of years, they migrated down the coast of California. Some of them went coastal on the ocean side of Sierra Nevadas. Some of them went inland on the desert side of Sierra Nevadas. Are they exposed to the same environmental factors? 100% no. So therefore, they are evolving to different ecological stress. And by the time they get to Southern California, they are now two different species. And they're two different species because look at them. Do they look the same? So the one lizard's looking at the other lizard or salamander and going, dude, I don't know what you are. I'm not having sex with you. And that's the definition of a species difference. You are two different species if you won't have sex, and they won't have sex. So they are now two different species because they evolved differently to different conditions. Sympatric we don't often see in nature. It's more with plants where you have evolution occur without a geographic boundary. Our biggest geographic boundary was plate tectonics. So remember, evolution, slow process, millions of years, just like plate tectonics. And we see animals that had a common ancestor during Pangea, and then when Pangea broke up, one of them ends up on one continent getting a certain set of environmental conditions, and another one ends up on a different continent with a different set of environmental conditions. So if you look at your llamas and your camels, they shared a common ancestor. They don't look anything alike anymore because they were exposed and evolved to different environmental conditions. But they came from a common ancestor, just like our African and Asian elephants. Last little bit here with evolution. There are two theories to how evolution occurs. The first one is punctuated equilibrium. This says that status quo. No one evolves, no one changes, we all stay the same until there's a massive environmental change, i.e. huge asteroid hits the Earth and kills 96% of what's here, and now there's all of these niches left to fill. The other theory is gradualism, which says evolution is always happening. There is always slow, constant change. I tend to believe the truth lies somewhere between the two, right? I tend to believe that gradualism is occurring, that our species are always evolving and adapting, but that there are periods, especially after mass extinctions, where we have to fill the niches, and then there's rapid mass evolution of what's left. So I think it's a combination of both. All right, random slide placement number 3. We see that climate change is affecting our organisms. Climate change in the Holocene, in the current, is rapid. It is so rapid that we are not having time to evolve to climate change. So instead of evolving to it, our animals, our things that are able to move, are doing permanent migration to stay within that temperature range they like. So the animals are good. Are the plants good? Can the plants easily do this? No, right? A plant can't like get up and walk on its roots and go north. Does that mean all of our plants are going to die? No, because as my animals move, some of the seeds are going to be on the fur of the animals, and then they're going to like shake in their new habitat, and some of our plants are going to make it. Not all of them though. The plants are going to have a harder time. While I was out the other day, you guys watched the video on extinctions. So we're going to kind of run through the mass extinctions that have occurred. We need to realize that geologic time is long. It is millions of years. That we have periods in our geologic time that is separated by our mass extinctions. So far there have been 5. We're in the midst of the 6th. We have episodic geologic time, which is defined by our planet coming in and out of ice ages. It's defined by our sea level rising and shrinking. We know, here's a test question for you, that extinction has always occurred. That humans are not the root of all evil. We have not caused every bad thing that has happened, and they try and trick you on the APIB test all the time with that question. Right? Extinction has always occurred. It is occurring right now without us. So like if we weren't here, there would still be extinction. And we call that background extinction. And we know that background extinction happens at the rate, we think, of 1 species per million species on the planet per year. But here's the problem. Do we know all of the species on the planet? No. Scientists are still discovering primates, which means there are scientists going into the jungles going, wow, that's a monkey that no one has ever seen before. And that boggles my mind that something as big as a monkey is still out there undiscovered. It boggles my mind that every year scientists go down to the fish markets in the Amazon and walk the market, and in the stalls are being sold fish that haven't been identified by science. That just was like, wow, there's so much out there left to discover. So we don't know how many species are out there. And that's like the big stuff, right? We're not even talking about the bacteria species that are out there, the microscopic stuff that we can't see. So we don't really know how many species. We know that as of 2016, there were 8,700,000 species identified living on the planet. Which means, right, 8.7 species per year is what we would expect for extinction. Do you think we're above or below background extinction? Above or below, guys? Above. Except for last year. Last year was a weird year. So I look it up every year so I can have accurate figures on your slide. Last year, we only had 5 species go out that we know of, right? We know that there are species that are going extinct before we can categorize them, but last year we only had 5. When we talk about the mass extinctions, the Ordovician-Silurian extinction killed 85% of all life on the planet. We think this was because we were entering an ice age, and so when the planet cooled and the sea levels dropped, 85% of everything living went extinct. That means that what was left then evolved to fill all the niches. Late Devonian mass extinction was a series of extinctions over 20 million years. Again, something that's hard to wrap your head around, that you had an extinction event that lasted 20 million years. Like, I think a day is long, but 20 million years for this extinction event. This was ocean acidification on steroids. So there was a mass release of carbon dioxide from the Earth's crust, which then acidified the oceans, which then killed 70% of all life, most of it in our shallow seas. Permian mass extinction, the Great Dying. 96% of all species went extinct, which means you are the result of the 4% that was left. So it's huge, right? There was mass evolution after this extinction event. Probably due to the fact that the planet warmed. And we're not talking like the 1 degree that we think humans are going to cause. We're talking the planet warmed by 10 to 15 degrees. Obviously, species couldn't handle that. Triassic-Jurassic, 75% of all life went extinct, and it led to the rise of the dinosaurs. The amount of oxygen in the atmosphere was very low. Mammals couldn't handle it. Birds couldn't handle it. But our bird-lizard hybrid here, our dinosaurs, they thrived and they got really big. The KT extinction. This is the one that took out the dinosaurs and 75% of everything else. We know this one was caused by an asteroid strike in the Gulf of Mexico. Huge asteroid, like the size of the Gulf of Mexico. So not a tiny little rock hitting the planet. It shook the Earth's crust and caused all of the volcanoes to erupt at once, which then immediately cooled the planet in a matter of a couple of years. That's what led to the extinction of everything. We are currently in the midst of the Holocene extinction, the 6th extinction. This is the extinction caused by man. This is the one that starts with man's appearance, and in a second I will show you a slide that shows that every time man appears on a continent, we see mass extinction of the animals on that continent. Our rate of extinction is accelerating, and so you see it start off really slow in the 1500s and then jump up in the 1900s. Again, last year was a weird year with only 5 going extinct. By the way, there is a video on here talking about the birds that we lost, because most of the 5 species that we did lose were birds. It also has an article about the other organisms that were lost. So how do we cause extinction? The first one is habitat loss. So we go in and we build our homes where these animals should be living. Like every year, people in Irvine freak out because coyotes are trying to kill their small children. The coyotes were there first. We built those homes in Portola Springs on barren hillsides where coyotes and mountain lions lived. We should not be surprised that they are still in the area. And when we do this, when we encroach on their habitat, they have a couple of choices. They come in and eat our children, or they go extinct, or they relocate. We have overexploited our species. We have overfished our fishing stock. So salmon's really good. We fish salmon almost to extinction. We've done it for sport. So back when the bison were at their highest population level is when we built the trains across the Central Plains. People were shooting bison out of train windows. So not shooting them to use the hides, not shooting them for the meat, just for the sport of shooting the bison. We bring in invasive species, and we're going to talk about those in a little bit. But basically, we bring animals in for our own good or by accident, and they are able to outcompete the native species. These guys tend to be generalists. They survive very well anywhere we put them. We pollute the environment, which causes problems. Well, how do we mitigate that then? How do we stop doing it? How do we stop extinction that's caused by humans? All of those things I mentioned, we can stop doing that, right? We can stop overfishing. We can stop killing things for sport. We can stop polluting our environment. Maybe we don't need new neighborhoods in Irvine. There are two phases to this Holocene extinction. The first one is man evolved. Man evolved with really big brains. Homo sapiens are really smart, even at the beginning of our evolution on the planet. We were so smart that there was another species on our planet of humans, and we outcompeted them. Well, or incorporated them. If you're a Northern European, you probably have a lot of Neanderthal blood or DNA in your body because there was some interbreeding between the two species we figured out. But for the most part, we outcompeted this other species of man. And then, because we were so smart and we were so good at hunting, we got rid of all of the mammoths, all of the mastodons, all of the large mammals in Australia. We were good at killing. Then in phase 2, we figured out it's a lot easier if we just settle down and start agriculture. And if we take our plains that grew grasses, and now we're going to grow grasses we can eat, like wheat and corn. And now we're going to only raise animals that we like to eat, like cows. If you look at this map down here, this is the one I was telling you about. The black arrow is when man showed up on the continent. The green is the amount of species on that continent. And you can see a big decline in the amount of species after man arrives there. When we settled down in that second phase of the Holocene, we domesticated some of our animals. We domesticated our cows. And we made that area that we were going to graze our cows specific for our cows. And our cows were able to outcompete anything else that normally lived and grazed in that area. And so now we've kind of got more cows than we have anything else. But that's good because cows are yummy. We also know that our bison, the iconic picture of the Americas, 90% of them carry cow DNA. So they are not pure bison anymore because the cows, found the bison attractive. We've domesticated the honeybee. And you think, well, how do you domesticate a bee? We've put them in hives, and there are people that make a living moving these hives from field to field. And so we take these bees that are in a hive, and we put them in an almond orchard. And for a month, they feed only on almond pollen, because that's what's closest. And then we put that hive on the back of a flatbed truck, and we take it over to a cornfield, and now they're going to eat only corn. This monoculture, this single diet of those bees decreased their resilience. They weren't as healthy. Just like if you guys only eat potato chips, you're not going to be as healthy as if you were to eat a normal natural diet of a little bit of everything. This has possibly led to our bee colony decrease, where we're starting to see entire bee populations disappear. Well, if the bees disappear, so do most of our plants, because they're our main pollinator. AP wants you to know about this special case of extinction of coral bleaching. So we are causing corals to die. The red is a healthy coral, the white is a coral that's been bleached. We've done this through climate change, increased water temperature kills the zooxanthellae. We've done it through our agriculture and our timber practices where we cut down trees and therefore dirt kind of washes out into the reef areas, which then clogs up the coral and it dies. We've done it through overfishing and disrupting their food chains, and we have done it through our sunscreen. So as you're snorkeling to look at the beautiful coral reef, all of the chemicals from your sunscreen are killing the coral. That's why they now have Ocean Safe sunscreen. That's not going to do that. This abbreviation over on the other side, HIPPCO, this is an AP test question here. It stands for what causes disruptions in our ocean environments. Habitat loss, invasive species, population growth of humans, pollution, climate change, and overfishing. So you do need to memorize that. Last thing I want to talk about, and again, aside number 4, is biomagnification. Biomagnification is the process of chemicals building up in the muscle of organisms. Lower on the food chain, not a big deal. They don't have enough of it in our system to cause harm. Higher in the food chain, we start to see detrimental effects. DDT in the condors was the classic example. The other example now, as we're talking about humans, is methylmercury. Methylmercury was released into the water through mining practices. It causes gold to clump. It's kind of cool. It's also released during manufacturing and rains down into our lakes and our oceans. Again, at lower levels in the food chain, not a big deal. Even in tuna, the tuna can have a lot and it's not a big deal. But if you eat too much of it, or if you're pregnant and you eat it, it causes neurological defects. It causes your neurons to start to degrade. If you're pregnant, your baby is not born. If you're not pregnant or you're a guy, you can actually go nuts because your nerves start to degrade. Not great. All right, that is the end. Go ahead, put your Chromebooks over on Lab Station 9 for me. Once you put your Chromebook away, come back to your seat. I am going to show Crash Course. So I ask that you pay attention during the video.
Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to Crash Course Big History. Today we're going to be traversing the evolutionary epic, the great story of magnificent beasts, terrifying predators, quite a lot of extinctions, and countless varieties of evolutionary forms. It's the ultimate epic, millions upon millions of species playing out a drama that has so far lasted 3.8 billion years, with 99% of the actors having already left the stage forever. And you thought finding employment in this job market was tough. You've already won the lottery, my friend. The keystone of our story is evolution by natural selection. So in the 1830s, a young Charles Darwin traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle. Inarguably, by the way, the most important beagle of all time. I apologize, Snoopy, but it's true. Darwin had the rare and amazing opportunity to study a great variety of the world's wildlife. And upon returning to England, he discovered that a variety of finches he had collected on the Galapagos Islands had beaks that were subtly adapted to their different environments environments and food sources. Darwin later combined this idea with the observation of how populations tend to overbreed and strain their resources. I mean, if there's competition for resources in an environment, then animals with useful traits would survive and pass those traits on to their offspring. Those who didn't survive long enough to reproduce would have their traits wiped out from the evolutionary tree. Natural selection. We talked some on Crash Course Big History about good science, and Darwin was a good scientist. He worked on his ideas for 2 decades, systematically finding new evidence to support his case, and then finally in 1859 he published On the Origin of Species, and it sent shockwaves around the world. The book offered an explanation for why so many species that seemed perfectly adapted to their environment could have been formed by a blind but elegant law of nature. Darwin's theory was so elegant yet so effective that his colleague Thomas Huxley exclaimed, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." Side note, if you ever read On the Origin of Species, try to get a first edition, because in later editions Darwin made a bunch of revisions in answer to some critics, but he got it actually more right the first time. Speaking of which, one of the phrases only included in the later editions and commonly attributed to Darwin was survival of the fittest, but that phrase was actually coined by Herbert Spencer, father of the more troubling social Darwinism, which tried to apply nature's rather harsh laws to human social orders.
I prefer Darwin's original phrase, natural selection. Everything from cuckoo birds that lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, to giraffes whose long necks are good for reaching food in high trees, to humans whose brains make up for their fragile bodies, are selected for naturally. An even better phrase, though, would be non-random selection, or maybe even non-random elimination. While all genetic mutations are generated by a random copying error or random variation completely beyond the animal's control, the selection of those traits is not random. Successful variations that allow you to survive and reproduce are determined by the very specific circumstances of your environment, where elimination, death, might not be far away. So the selection of your traits is done by a very specific and sometimes brutal list of criteria. This is why people who say that they don't understand how all animals could have evolved by chance don't really understand how evolution works. Here's another phrase that doesn't get it right. Evolution is just a theory. In everyday speech, theory means guess. But in science, a theory is something that was tested time and time again, explains many different observations, and is backed up by a mountain of evidence. Evolution is a theory like gravity is a theory, and you don't go jumping out your window because gravity is just a theory. Why are we so certain? Emily knows.
Evolution is one of the most tested, most utilized, and widely accepted theories in science. It's backed up by literal tons of fossil evidence, which can show us shared traits with species that no longer exist and help us map out lines of descent for creatures around today. DNA sequencing further tells us about lines of descent, and you can measure the commonality of the DNA possessed by 2 animals to tell how closely related they are and when they may have split off from a common ancestor. Radiometric dating allows us to assign dates to various fossils, further